Good evening, friends. We start tonight in Syria. After weeks of negotiations, there is still no agreement on a ceasefire for eastern Ghouta, an area outside the capital of Damascus. The United States, France, and Britain have accused Russia of worsening a humanitarian crisis in Syria with an assault on rebel-held territories full of civilians. However, Russia says the area is largely held by terrorist groups such as al-Nusra. At a UN Security Council meeting today called by Russia, Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia put much of the blame on the mainstream media.
There is a massive psychosis in the mainstream media which is spreading the same rumors day after day. It doesn't help to understand the situation at all. They put forward the idea that there are only hospitals in eastern Ghouta, which the Syrian army are fighting against. Russia will continue to work to bring peace and stability to Syria and calls on other countries to do the same, rather than creating havoc, supporting jihadists and tearing the region apart.
For more, we're joined tonight by former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. Jim, sort this out for us. What's the truth here?
What the truth is that virtually all of the so-called rebels fighting against the Syrian government are some kind of offshoot from al-Qaeda, whether they're talking about Ahrar al-Sham or Jaish al-Islam or al-Nusra, whatever their name is this week. The Western governments know this, but they're playing the atrocity porn card. We know there are civilians suffering there. Efforts should be made to try to alleviate that, just like we saw in Aleppo a few months ago when the Syrian and Russian forces liberated that city. But the same thing happens when U.S.-supported forces push Daesh or ISIS out of Mosul or out of Raqqa. We don't hear about that so much in the Western media.
The company line today from the State Department was that the United States doesn't have any resources or troops there in Syria doing anything. Is that true?
Well, we certainly have troops in Syria. We have at least 2,000, maybe more than that. Some people say it's double that number in northeastern Syria with the Kurdish forces. We've had intelligence assets embedded there really throughout the 7 years of this war, almost 7 years of this war. That's simply not the case. And plus our proxies, the Saudis, the Qataris, and so forth, have been deeply involved with these groups.
It seems like lawmakers on Capitol Hill don't get the message or see the big picture that if the United States and Russia had a better relationship, maybe the situation in Syria wouldn't be what it is right now. What about that?
I think what that points to is that behind all of this hue and cry about Russiagate and everything else is that there's a strong body of opinion in both parties in the establishment that doesn't want better relations with Russia because so much of our establishment and a lot of money depends on permanent enmity. And that gets then to the regional questions. We need to defeat the Iranians. This has nothing to do with terrorism. It has to do with defeating the Iranians in Syria, and that means Assad must go, even if it means bringing these terrorist groups to power.
What's going to be the result of this Turkish aggression?
You talk about it now in Afrin with the Kurds. We don't really know, especially now that the Kurds have invited government forces into the Afrin region. There is the possibility that it actually could come to some accord between Syria and Turkey because, in effect, the Kurds would have to accept some kind of affiliation or even authority of the Damascus government, and that largely answers Turkey's concerns.
So we're dealing with a country, clearly, that has got a number of different hot spots. What's the chances for a ceasefire and to get humanitarian aid? I mean, clearly, Assad and the Russians feel that there are terrorists in the areas that they're hitting. The United States says, no, that's not true. And then, of course, there was a hit on some Russian troops not long ago, some mercenaries. Exactly. I mean, this is so complex. How are they ever going to come to any kind of ceasefire?
There are really so many different theaters we're talking about here. We're talking about Afrin with the Turks. We're talking about the place where we hit those Russian contractors and killed an indeterminate number of them. That's between the Kurds and the government forces in the eastern part of the country. Ghouta is right next to Damascus, the capital, and this is a completely different cast of characters. There is a balance between what can reasonably be done to get humanitarian aid in, but also not allow an advantage to the terrorist forces. I'm afraid a lot of this hue and cry coming from the Western governments and media is really designed to save those terrorist forces.
And it was President Trump on the campaign trail who said, wouldn't it be good if we got along with Russia? That would be a good solution right now.
And he's been hogtied, and I think that's the real tragedy here, Ed.
Jim Jatras, thanks so much tonight.